I chose today's lesson because it's about radical hospitality and the dedication of the temple in Old Testament times. And today we are rededicating this hospitable sanctuary, which was renovated last year during the height of the pandemic. We set this day earlier this year when it looked like the pandemic would mostly be over, the church would be returning to normal. Obviously, looks can be deceiving. The pandemic is still going on and we are not ready to return to normal. We decided to go ahead and do the rededication anyway, since we've waited a year and it seems overdue. A lot of work was done up here last year. The walls and ceilings were patched and painted. A new sound system was put in, including special headphones for those with hearing issues. We redid the choir loft, and all the pews out there were repositioned. We also put in some new lighting and a great new heating system. Oh, and this may be the coolest thing of all. For the first time since 1868, there is air conditioning up here. As they say nowadays, woohoo! This space was very holy and sacred before those renovations, but it does feel extra special to have it so nice and sparkling. Along with responsible care for this historic building, hospitality was a motivating factor in all the fixes and upgrades, making it welcoming and pleasant and practical. And a lot of folks worked to make it all happen. A lot of folks helped finance it too. We are blessed with many good resources. And at one point, somebody else was going to be in charge of overseeing it all, and I'm still not quite sure how he was talked into it, but Brad Taylor ended up taking on that monumental task. We can thank Brad for his overseeing the renovations. We can do that right now with applause. Thank you, Brad. And thanks to everyone else who helped. Lots of people helped. So let's applaud them too. There's a reception out in the courtyard afterward with cookies and water to celebrate the renovation. So please join us out there. And I think if we keep our distance, we can have our masks off and see each other's faces for the first time in 18 months. So, by now, many of you may have figured out I like history. I'm particularly enamored with local history and our own church history. And I went back and I dug around in the church archives, and some records, original records of the original construction of this building exist. The records indicate a construction committee was formed right after the Civil War in 1866, and that this building was completed in the middle of the Advent and Christmas season of 1868. The first services occurred on December 12th and December 13th. And on Saturday the 12th, our fourth pastor, Reverend Leonard, was invited back to preach at the official dedication service. And I was tickled to learn he chose as his text one that I often lift up, Acts 17:29, about how we live and move and have our being in God. The next day, on Sunday the 13th, our third pastor, Reverend Strebe, was invited to preach in the first Sunday worship ever in this building. By then, Reverend Strebe was pretty famous with a national reputation as an anti-slavery and civil rights leader. He was quite a hero in that movement. The scripture choice for that dedication Sunday was the text that Casey read so nicely. And get this, I found that out after I chose the text and wrote the first draft of the sermon, which also leads me to discover. In a little bit, we're going to have a short formal rededication in this service, but before we do that, I'm going to talk about a lesson on hospitality and that first dedication of the first temple. The scripture reading for today was likely written around the time of the Babylonian exile. Babylon destroyed the temple, conquered the Israelites, and forced marched its leading citizens to captivity in Babylon. And after the attack on the temple and the exile, it would have been easy to hate on foreigners claim that God hated them. We've seen some of that sort of approach in the aftermath of the terrible tragedy of 9/11 in our own country. That's not what the Israelites took away from it, at least not in our reading from 1 Kings, which has this great message about hospitality, and treating foreigners, strangers well, not hating and blaming them all and thinking God does too. The words the exilic writers put on Solomon's formal prayer for what modern theologians call radical hospitality. It's really quite remarkable that those who suffered the Babylonian exile, imagine Solomon, who had lived many years before, had prayed not only that foreigners be welcome into the temple, but that God answer the foreigners' prayers. Aliens were to be respected as those in the exile wished to be respected. And so the prayer includes these words of radical hospitality. When a foreigner who is not of your people, Israel, comes from a distant land because of your name, for they shall hear of your great name, your mighty hand, and your outstretched arm. When a foreigner comes and prays towards this house, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all that the foreigner calls to, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and so that they may know that your name has been invoked on this house that I have built. That's a model approach toward aliens for any nation, for any religion. It's a prayer for tolerance and inclusiveness in worship and for an honoring of strength. It's a model attitude for all houses of worship, for worshipers of God. It's a solid theological claim that God embraces all of humanity. And just as there are no bounds to God's love, there are to be no bounds to access to God and God's house of worship. And this amounts to such radical hospitality that that first temple was open to absolutely everyone. This amounts to such radical hospitality that following suit, worship in this sanctuary is open to absolutely everyone. We can and we do hope that everyone's heartfelt prayers for well-being are heard and answered. And claiming and living the truth that there are no strings attached to God's presence or God's love, that's an expression of radical hospitality. I hear from time to time how the Old Testament seems irrelevant, but that radical hospitality that we try to follow every Sunday in this holy space, that hospitality is a constant theme in those Hebrew texts. It's clearly relevant. Strangers are not just welcome, but treated well and treated equally. Again, it's supposed to be like that in all nations and in all religions. A command in Leviticus sums up God's desire in this regard really well. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself. The most famous words of Jesus about love actually come directly from the Old Testament. You shall love your neighbor as yourselves, found in Leviticus 19. Jesus, a very Jewish rabbi, derived his theology from sacred Jewish texts. Solomon's prayer was written well after Solomon lived. It was written while the Jews were in exile, strangers in a strange land. And the part of the prayer that we are looking at today can be heard as an early exilic version of do to strangers in our temple what we want done to ourselves. And to ask God to do to their prayers as we want done to our prayers. And Jesus' wisdom, of course, leads to this as well. His second most famous teaching is to do to others what we want done to us. Here in this space, we have worked to offer that radical hospitality since 1868. And the repairs and updating and sprucing up we did was to take good care of this space and to continue that hospitality. But as wonderful as it is, this building is only a small part of that hospitality. It takes all of us here, all of us who make up the church, to provide the hospitality to one another and equally to foreigners and to strangers. We must take actions to be loving and to do to others as we would want done to ourselves. The work on this building is great. It looks great. It sounds great. And with the work done in this updated and renovated